First Avenue construction area, dawn. A construction sign fills the screen. It reads, on this location, the New York Medical University Center will build a drug rehabilitation community center to be completed in 1973. E.F. Schlager and Company, contractors. Suddenly the sign comes crashing down into camera. It has been wrenched off the wooden fence protecting the row of tenements and brownstones being demolished. About a dozen young and loud militants have torn it down. Camera pans to show the row of houses behind the fence, two of which have already been reduced to rubble. The others have been boarded up. The demolition generators and cranes are parked silently along the curb. In the dark of 5 a.m., three black families carrying children and children carrying household effects, mattresses, pots, pans, bags of groceries, etc., are repossessing the condemned buildings. First Avenue construction area, day, 10 a.m. Strong sun overhead. The street has been roped off, and police are all over the place. A sparse crowd of 100 or so throng the side streets off First Avenue. Signs read, people see, doctors know. A Channel 11 mobile news crew, newspaper photographers, and a radio newscaster are recording the situation with desultory interest. A police captain stands in the middle of the cordoned street, bullhorning the occupiers of the condemned brownstones, who can be seen through the broken windows. Police captain, I repeat, I'm asking you to come out peacefully. These buildings are condemned and unfit for habitation. A piece of brick arches down from the roof of a building and cracks the street a few feet from the captain. Police captain. Sighs. Tries again. You people are possessing this building illegally and in violation of the law. I'm asking you to come out peacefully. Holly Pavilion, entrance lobby day. A small press conference is going on in a corner of the lobby. Reporters cluster and TV cameras surround the press representative of the hospital, a young woman in her 30s named Evelyn Bassey, who was trying to read a statement squinting under her mod glasses at the blaze of lights set up by the camera crews. Mrs. Bassey, reading. Complete sympathy with the tenants. So the hospital has assumed the responsibility of finding 400 housing units in good buildings. The hospital wishes to point out that this particular row of buildings on First Avenue was condemned by the city before the hospital acquired ownership, and even then only after responsible leaders in the community had approved the building of our new drug rehabilitation center. Sundstrom's office. Sundstrom explodes on the phone. God damn it, Barry, I've got a dozen community leaders waiting for me in the library. We've been trying to work out some kind of negotiable formula for 2 years. And with no help from you in the Urban Affairs Division, I might add. Dr. Welbeck appears in the doorway. He's in his 50s, gray, distinguished, and very tanned, with terribly, terribly kindly old country doctor eyes. He wears a camel hair topcoat. He smiles benignly and twinkles at Sundstrom from one of the leather chairs across the desk from the director. Sundstrom hardly notices Welbeck. And I'm not going to throw all that down the drain because some cockamamie activist group is showboating for the television cameras. You get those people out of those buildings before a wall collapses or a fire breaks out, and we've got a riot on our hands, okay? He hangs up, sighs, turns to the man across the desk. Welbeck. Smiles, twinkles. Having your troubles, eh? Well, I won't take much of your time. My name's Welbeck. I've been associated with this hospital for 6 years, and yesterday afternoon Dr. Gilly called me to say he was cutting off my privileges at the hospital. Do you know anything about it? Sundstrom glances at his watch. It's news to me. Welbeck. He said he sent the report on. Sundstrom. I'll probably get it tomorrow. Report on what? Welbeck. Well, I'm not sure myself. I did a nephrectomy on a man about 7 days ago. Emergency. Called in at 4 in the morning. The man was hemorrhaging. He'd gone sour. Sundstrom. Well, Beck, I'm terribly sorry, but I do have this meeting. Crosses to the door. In any event, there's nothing I can do about it. If Gilly wants to cut your privileges, he's chief of surgery. It's within his province. You'll have to have the hearing. He exits, followed by Welbeck into the director's suite, secretary's offices. Buzzing now, typewriters clicking, phones ringing. Welbeck. I have a laparotomy laid out on for this morning. I assume I'll be allowed to go through with that. Sundstrom. Of course. Welbeck, huffing a little. I've been associated with this hospital for 6 years. Sundstrom. Now, Welbeck. It seems to me I've had your name down here before for something. To his secretary en passant. I'll be in the staff room. He and Welbeck pass out into the executive corridor. Flowing with a normal stream of traffic, Sundstrom and Welbeck turn right and head down to the last room of the corridor. Something comes to him and Sundstrom pauses. Sundstrom. Wait a minute. You're the fellow with the Medicaid collecting business who incorporated and went public, right? I mean, something like that? Milton Meade was telling me about you just the other day. You're a whole medical conglomerate. You've got a factoring service, a computerized billing company, and a few proprietary hospitals, a few nursing homes. Good heavens, Welbeck, you shouldn't be brought up before a committee of mere doctors. You should be investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. You'll have to go through with the hearing, Welbeck. I don't interfere in these things. He opens the door of the staff room and strides in. Even before he enters, we get a blast of angry voices, both male and female. For the moment, the door is ajar. We see our harried Milton Meade being assailed by angry blacks and Puerto Ricans and young white activist doctors. Hospital library. Voices, all overlapping. No goddamn halfway house. No way, baby. We ain't gonna wait till 1973 to deal with this problem. We want to kill the drug thing right now. Imperializing the black Puerto Rican community, and we reject the bourgeois-ass middle-class black traders and flunkies who are selling out the black Puerto Rican proletariat masses to the expansionist racist policies of this shit hospital. Woman. Let's get back to the abortion issue. Voice. Sit down, woman. Woman. What the hell does the male establishment know about abortions? There's an agitated reaction in the crowd. Black woman. Who the hell raised the issue of birth control? The issue at hand is the control of drug addiction in this community and in the ghetto generally. A black man jumps up and points off right. Black man. We don't want no goddamn abortion. A white doctor jumps in from the left. White doctor. Let's get down to the core of this matter. More murmuring. A Che Guevara-styled revolutionary moves toward Meade and Sundstrom at the table. Man, the point is that this hospital is the landlord for those buildings, and they should have turned them down. Angrily, he leans over the table facing Sundstrom. Man, those buildings are imperialistic extensions of the medical establishment. This hospital ought to be rebuilding those tenements, give those people decent housing. Sundstrom raises his hands for quiet and starts to rise. The hostile din has gotten to him. Sundstrom. Please. Holly Pavilion, room 806. William Meade is transferred from his bed to a rolling stretcher by an orderly in shirt and trousers, and by Nurse Felicia Chile. Nurse Chile tucks Meade in. He opens his eyes to look at her drowsily. William Meade, under sedation. You know, I hallucinated last night. I hallucinated there was an Indian doing a war dance in here. Nurse Chile, affably. You weren't hallucinating, Mr. Meade. There was an Indian in here last night. William Meade, staring through his sedation at her. There was? They wheel him out into Holly Pavilion's surgical area corridor. Meade is wheeled down the corridor by the orderly. At the far end, an anesthetized patient, blue in the harsh light, fresh from surgery, is being wheeled into a recovery room. Surgery is busy and efficient, but not as clinically tidy as we'd like. Linens and equipment and surgical gear are piled into corners or on empty stretchers. Green uniformed nurses, doctors, and orderlies go in and out of the many doors flanking the corridor. This is the non-sterilized area, where doctors and nurses confer in the corridors. 3 black orderlies await an assignment, sit on stretchers, chuckle, mutter. Phones can be heard ringing. The orderly wheeling Meade turns left into the surgical area central plaza. A small, cluttered central area with the office of the operating room nurse supervisor on the right and the holding for anesthesia room on the left. The OR is like the emergency ward, desperately busy but staffed by people grown so accustomed to it that they display a calm, almost casual but febrile efficiency. A large blackboard faces the supervisor's office with the day's schedule of operations neatly chalked in. It is full. A middle-aged surgeon, still in his overcoat, is studying the schedule. A green uniformed nurse swings through the glass doors from the operating room area to lean into the supervisor's office. Nurse. Dr. Norris says about a half an hour. Second nurse. Tell Shirley it was just an ovarian cyst. The third nurse leans back into the supervisor's office to relay this information. Third nurse. Shirley, it was just an ovarian cyst. This is apparently good news, for we hear someone saying, voice off screen, "Oh, thank God." An orderly rumbles by with an EKG machine. OR nursing supervisor Dorothy Kimball, a pleasant lady in her late 30s, leans out of her office to speak to one of the lounging orderlies. Mrs. Kimball, handing the orderly a slip. All right, Jerry, go up to Holly 6. The orderly detaches himself from his cronies and exits. It is into this atmosphere of subdued febrility that William Meade is wheeled. Orderly to Mrs. Kimball. William Meade from Holly 8. Mrs. Kimball. Hold him there, Tom. We've got somebody coming out right now. Indeed, a stretcher is being wheeled out of the holding room. The patient is covered. As the orderly wheels her past camera, we may recognize the pale, sleeping profile of Miss Campanella, the nurse who had been cushed with a sandbag not many scenes ago. A circulating nurse comes through the glass doors, examines the chart dangling from the stretcher. Mrs. Kimball, to this nurse. Who's that? Manga Franny? Circulating nurse, checking wristband. Yeah. To orderly. Number 3, Marty. The orderly wheels the silent Miss Campanella off to operating room 3, as Dr. Welbeck, in his natty blue suit carrying his camel coat, turns in from the outer corridor and examines the blackboard. He goes back to outer corridor. Welbeck crosses, opens a door, and enters. Surgeon's locker room. All 4 walls are lined with lockers. Shelves and cartons of green surgical clothes, caps, masks, trousers, shoe coverings. Obviously, surgeons dress for their operations here. 2 surgeons, one middle-aged and the other a young resident, are changing. The resident turns to Welbeck on his entrance and says, Resident, it's legal for a doctor to incorporate New York, isn't it, doctor? Welbeck, en route to phone. Since last September. If they had that when I was your age, I'd have put away a couple of million by now. Dials. It gives you a variety of deferral devices, profit sharing, for example. Let's say you pick yourself an October 31st fiscal. You declare a bonus payable in 71. An accrued item payable to a principal shareholder must be paid within 2.5 months after the close of the year to get the deduction in the prior year. But your corporation doesn't pay that tax because we've eliminated the taxable income with the bonus. With 2 taxable entities, you can bury a hell of a lot of expenses. On phone. Hello? This is Welbeck. Any messages? Well, I'm at the hospital. I have to cut open some guy in a couple of minutes. I'll try to make it as fast as I can. How urgent did he say it was? Well, Dr. Hogan made those arrangements with the underwriters. The registration statement was filed with the SEC well over a year ago. If he calls again, have me paged here. Hangs up, turns back to the attentive young doctors to conduct his class in medical finance while changing into surgical scrub. The really big money is in health leasing, of course. Dr. Hogan, the eminent orthopedic surgeon, and I incorporated a leasing company and went public last year. I hold a controlling interest in a number of proprietary hospitals, nursing homes, and rest farms, and I've been leasing hospital equipment to my own hospitals at excessive rates. Why, you ask, am I draining my own hospitals? Well, my hospitals are taxed at 48%, and I'm giving my leasing company a hell of a price-earnings ratio, which will balloon the market value of the stock. I hold 300,000 shares of that stock, lettered of course, but in a year I'll dump those shares at a capital gain and walk off with a bundle. Operating room 3. Just like on TV. Well, almost. The surgeon, Dr. Mallory, a bad-tempered man in his 50s, sits on a stool with his gloved hands wrapped in a towel, waiting for the 2 surgical residents to finish painting the operable area, which happens to be the abdomen. It's a hysterectomy. The patient is sheeted except for the small square of abdominal area. Dr. Mallory. Mangafrani, right? Scrub nurse. Right. Dr. Mallory grumbles to one of the residents. What do you say, huh? We're not going to hang it in the Louvre, you know. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Chu, injects pentothal in the IV tube. Dr. Chu. Bring a mask over. The resident anesthesiologist trundles over the oxygen tank, takes the hypodermic syringe from Dr. Chu, who now applies the oxygen mask to the enmarbled profile of the patient. He studies the gauges and equipment around him at the head of the operating table. Resident anesthesiologist. There's no pulse, doctor. Dr. Chu. What's the pressure? Resident anesthesiologist. There's no blood pressure, doctor. Dr. Chu. No pulse. Get the tube and the EKG. Dr. Mallory. What's the matter? Resident. I can't feel a thing, sir. The room galvanizes into the swift, silent activity of a chest massage. Dr. Mallory, standing and stretching in the back of the room, turns and moves toward this off-screen patient. He begins a vigorous rhythmic massage of the patient's rib cage over the heart. Dr. Mallory. What the hell happened? Dr. Mallory thumps the patient's chest hard with his fist, and the others likewise go to work. Dr. Chu. I don't know. She must have thrown an embolus. She was doing fine up to now. To resident anesthesiologist. Did you check the gases? Resident anesthesiologist. I did, sir. Dr. Chu. The only time I ever saw anybody conk out like this, some jerk switched the nitrous oxide and the gas lines. The scrub nurse is applying electrode paste to the defibrillators. Dr. Mallory yanks the sheets and hospital shirt off the patient and begins very rigorous massage of the exposed ribs. We can hear one rib crack. Dr. Mallory. Get the damn leads on. For Christ's sakes, what the hell is this? Resident. She's just a young woman, sir. Do you think we should open the chest? Dr. Mallory, defibrillating. She's 53, you buttonhead. Resident, off-screen. Bicarb? Dr. Chu, who has been inserting suprol and bicarbonate into the tube of the patient's IV, is frowning at her rigid, white-capped face. He leans over to check the EKG readings. Dr. Chu. She's fibrillating, doctor. Mallory straddles the patient. He's doing heavy heart massage. Dr. Mallory. Jesus H. Christ. Dr. Chu. Okay, stop for a minute, doctor. Dr. Chu pushes back, the operating cap on the patient's head revealing jet black hair. Mallory starts to massage again. Dr. Mallory, barking at the scrub nurse. You got those paddles ready? Dr. Chu stares blankly at the patient's face, then looks up at the sweating surgeon perched on the operating table, rhythmically crushing away at the patient's rib cage. Dr. Chu, I may be crazy, doctor, but I don't think this is your patient. Dr. Mallory, now pausing for a moment, looks up. He is beaded with sweat. Dr. Mallory, what the hell are you talking about? He massages away. Another rib cracks. Holly Pavilion box office. The supervisor of nurses, Mrs. Christie, is sitting on a chair reading a report. Bach, now in his doctor's coat, is hunched over his desk, hands clasped. Bach. Now, I don't want to get into an institutional hassle with you, Mrs. Christie. The malpractice here is monumental. As you see, Dr. Schaefer's blood sugar was 23. No glucose solution is going to do that. The only thing that will do that is at least 50 units of insulin, probably more. The only presumption is that one of those nurses on the 8th floor shot 50 units of insulin into Schaefer's bloodstream, either by injection or through the IV. Although, how in God's name? Mrs. Christie's electric pocket pager beeps. Mrs. Christie. I'm very sorry, doctor. Reaches for a phone. May I? Miss McGuire leans in from the secretary's office. Miss McGuire to Bach. Doctor, did you ask the head nurse on the 8th floor to let you know when a Miss Drummond got there? Bach. Yes. Miss McGuire. Well, she just got there. Bach. Thank you. Mrs. Christie on phone. Oh, dear me, Dorothy. I better get right down there directly. Have you called the OOD? And you better call Dr. Gilly. And you better call Mr. Sloan. Yes, I'll be down directly. Hangs up to Bach. I'm very sorry, doctor, but there's a real nasty one in the OR. They've just operated on the wrong patient. OR nursing supervisor's office. Crowded now. The administrative resident Hitchcock is here, and a uniformed man in his 50s, Mr. Sloan, the chief of safety and traffic. Sloan represents the hospital's security force. Mrs. Kimball is at her desk on the phone. Mrs. Kimball, on phone. Well, I don't understand. Is she back in her room? When did she get back to her room? Who brought her back? She stares at Hitchcock. She's back in her room. Hitchcock. Who? Mrs. Kimball. Mrs. Mangafrani, the woman who was supposed to have been operated on. Calls to a nurse passing. Are they still working on that woman in 3? Nurse. Yeah. Mrs. Kimball, back on phone. I'm sorry, Mrs. Freed. Would you say that again? Well, nobody in this office sent her back up. Well, all right, Mrs. Freed, I'll have to call you back. She hangs up, stands, goes out into the operating area plaza, where 3 orderlies lounge about. Mrs. Kimball. Did any of you take a woman named Manga Franny out of the holding room back up to Holly 5 around 10 o'clock? Apparently none of these 3. Mrs. Christie turns in from the outer corridor. Normal operating room activity flows by. Patients wheeled to and from their various surgeries. Surgeons checking the blackboard. Staff doctors. Orderlies keeping the noise level low but steady. Mrs. Christie, to Hitchcock in the doorway. What happened? Hitchcock shrugs helplessly. Mrs. Kimball, to Mrs. Christie. I don't know what happened. A patient named Manga Franny was scheduled for a hysterectomy at 10 o'clock, Dr. Mallory. I talked to Sylvia in the holding room who admitted her, so she was here. And now I just spoke to Mrs. Freed on Holly 5, and she says an orderly brought Mrs. Manga Franny back to her room about 20 minutes ago. Now Mrs. Manga Franny is in her room sleeping. Mrs. Christie. Well, who's the woman in the operating room? Mrs. Kimball. I don't know. Mrs. Kimball, Mrs. Christie, Hitchcock, and Sloane pushed through the glass doors to the crossroads of the operating rooms. Through each window, we see operating crews hacking away. Mrs. Christie. Is she dead? Mrs. Kimball. Well, they had to open her up, and that's not good. They gather in anticipation outside OR3 and peer over each other's shoulders into the room where the operating crew is hunched over the open heart massage. The masked circulating nurse looks up, notices the audience at the door, and gives a hopeless shrug. Hitchcock. I better get Mr. Meade. Holly Pavilion, the staff room. Milton Meade is sitting in a back seat of the staff room. A lounge with couches, easy chairs, and magazine racks gives half an ear to the several opinions being simultaneously expressed by Lady from Women's Lib. Abortion. The clinic should be under the supervision and entirely staffed by women and administered by a member of the Women's Committee for Medical Liberation. Young white activist. Let's get to the core of the matter, which is the criminal and gangster collusion between the American medical establishment and the drug, insurance, and tobacco companies who, through their combined racketeering efforts, have produced a dual system of healthcare. Everything for the rich and nothing for the poor. And by Black Panther. Abortion clinic. That's genocide, baby. You're just killing off blacks. We consider proliferation elemental to class struggle. And by Sundstrom, who has lost his cool altogether and is screaming right along with everyone else. For God's sake, we've got 11 people in these buildings and we've got to get them out of here. We can rectify the injustices of the world tomorrow, but right now, for God's sake, can we get those people out of those buildings? Will you people please listen to me? Will you people please shut up and listen to me? Will you people please call a halt to this participatory democracy and address ourselves to the immediate problem? During this maelstrom, the phone at Meade's elbow rings. Meade answers it, listens, nods, returns to the receiver, stands and slips out of the room into the delicious silence of the Holly Pavilion executive corridor, where Hitchcock emerges from the administration offices. The two men move down the hall toward each other. Milton Meade. How long ago did this happen? Hitchcock. About a half an hour. Milton Meade. Have you called the medical examiner? Hitchcock. Not yet. Milton Meade. Well, you better do that now, and you better call the precinct station house as well. Operating room 3. Dr. Mallory is wrenching off his blood-drenched rubber gloves and flinging them to the floor in a rage. The door to the room opens and Mrs. Kimball, Mrs. Christie, and Mr. Sloane enter. Dr. Mallory is stupefied with anger. Dr. Chu, blessed with Eastern containment, blandly gathers his equipment together, nods to Mrs. Christie. Dr. Chu. Good morning, Mrs. Christie. Good morning, Doctor. Dr. Chu. This is really something, isn't it? I thought she looked a little different when they brought her in. I even said to one of the nurses, she looks a little younger without her dentures. I'd only talked to her half an hour before. Mrs. Christie. Does anybody know who she is? Dr. Mallory can only stare at her numbly. He turns and stares numbly at Mr. Sloane. Mrs. Christie. To Mrs. Kimball, examining the chart dangling from the operating table. What's her chart say? Circulating resident. Her chart says Manga Franny. Her bracelet says Manga Franny. The only thing that isn't Manga Franny is the woman. Dr. Mallory finally explodes. Dr. Mallory. Jesus H. Christ. I've been chopping out 3 uteruses a day for 20 years, and is it too much to expect for you people to bring in the right goddamn Jesus Christ uterus? Dr. Chu. I had just been talking to her in the holding room. She was perfectly fine, a little drowsy. I thought it was funny that when they brought her in, she was out cold. Dr. Mallory, shuffling around in aimless circles. Jesus H. Christ. Mrs. Christie stares down at the face of the dead patient on the table, who has had her chest spread wide open so that the organs are exposed. Mrs. Christie. Well, we'll just all have to stay here until Mr. Mead or someone from the OOD comes back. Dr. Mallory. Well, I'm not taking the rap for this. I've got one malpractice suit pending, and I'm not taking the rap for this one. Holly Pavilion Room 806. William Mead's bed is empty. The Reverend Drummond's suit, still on its hanger, is lying on it. Drummond himself lies comatose and rigged out with IVs and catheters. Barbara Drummond is packing her father's things into an open one-suiter valise. The door opens. She looks up. It's Bach. They look at each other. Two people in love. Bach. Look, you're not going. I love you and I'm not going to let you go. He picks up the suit lying on the bed. Bach. Come on, let's start putting your father's things back. He's staying here. Hangs the suit in the closet. I'll find an apartment somewhere. I'm staying in a filthy little hotel room. We can't use that. His eyes are caught by a white doctor's uniform hanging in the armoire along with the suits and overcoats of the two patients in the room. He bends over to peer at the nameplate over the breast pocket. Barbara. I can't make it here, Herb. I'll crack up. I cracked up once already. 1 week here and I'd be running naked through the streets screaming again. I can retain my sanity only in a simple society. Bach. For God's sake, Barbara, you can't seriously see me living in a grass shack hunting jackrabbits for dinner. Be sensible, for God's sake. Barbara. I am being sensible. What is it you're so afraid of leaving here? Your plastic home? Your conditioned air? Your synthetic clothes? Your instant food? I'm offering you green silence and solitude, the natural order of things. Mostly, I'm offering me. I think we're beautiful, Herb. Bach, utterly in love. You make it sound almost plausible. Barbara. I don't know why you even hesitate. What's holding you here? Is it your wife? Bach. No, that's all over. I suppose if I'm married to anything, it's this hospital. It's been my whole life. I just can't walk out on it as if it never mattered. I'm middle class. Among us, love doesn't triumph over all. Responsibility does. Barbara. Herb, don't ask me to stay here with you because I love you, and I will, and we'll both be destroyed. He turns to her again. They both look away. Barbara. I've got the bill here to pay yet. Bach. I'll come with you. She gathers her raincoat and goes. Bach follows her out into the Holly Pavilion 8th floor corridor, where Dr. Joseph Lagerman, head of nephrology, perhaps remembered from an earlier scene, has been waiting for Bach. He joins them en route to the elevators. Lagerman. Herb, you asked me to find that dialysis nurse. Bach. What dialysis nurse? Barbara has continued walking. Bach starts to follow her. Barbara. I'll go pay the bill. Lagerman. The one who goofed on your patient, Drummond. Bach turns back to Lagerman. Lagerman. Well, her name is Teresa Campanella, but you are not going to believe this, Herb. She died on the operating table in OR 3 about an hour ago. Barbara is disappearing into an elevator. Bach starts after her, then turns back to Lagerman. Bach. What do you mean she died on the operating table in OR 3? They hurry down the corridor to the elevators. Bach. You mean she was the one? Lagerman. That's the one. I just identified her. Bach. What the hell's going on around here? Every time I try to find somebody in this hospital, they either died of a heart attack in emergency or of anesthesia shock in an operating room. Elevator doors open. A nurse and a visitor get out. Bach and Lagerman go into the elevator. 2 or 3 people besides the elevator operator are there, as well as a patient on a stretcher and an orderly. Lagerman. Listen, I just came from the OR. They're trying to find a Dr. Schaefer. Don't you have a kid named Schaefer in your service? Bach scowls, mutters. I had a Schaefer. He died yesterday of an overdose of insulin. What do they want Schaefer for? Lagerman. The holding room nurse says there was a Dr. Schaefer hanging around the holding room. It wouldn't have been your Schaefer anyway. The nurse says it was senior staff, a middle-aged man. Bach. There's no senior staff named Schaefer in this hospital. Lagerman. I told them that. I said I don't know any senior staff around here named Schaefer. They've got detectives down there, everything. It's a whole big investigation. The elevator door stops at the 7th floor. The doors open and Bach and Lagerman stroll into Holly Pavilion's 7th floor corridor. Bach lumbers down the west corridor, turns into room 806. William Meade, sedated and apparently zonked out cold, is being transferred from a stretcher back into bed by an OR orderly and a nurse's aide. Bach rolls back the curtains around Drummond's bed, revealing the comatose patient. His face sculptured against the white pillow, an IV tube in his right arm, a catheter projecting from under the sheet. Bach lowers the protective railing, leans in, takes the man's pulse on his neck, raises one closed eyelid, then the other. The pupils stare vacuously back at him. The eyelids drop closed as soon as they are released. In the background, the orderly and aide finish tucking in William Meade and exit, wheeling their creaking stretcher out. The room is shockingly silent. Bach goes to the window and frowns in thought. Hold across the patient Drummond, on Bach in the background at the window with his back to us. Suddenly, Drummond's eyes open. He lies rigid, his eyes staring dementedly into the air above him. Slowly, his left hand reaches out and carefully withdraws the catheter from his bladder, lays it on the white sheet beside him, and silently reaches over to withdraw the IV needle from his right arm. He lets the needle dangle, dripping onto the bed. Carefully, he twists out from under his sheet, swings his legs over the side of the bed, and sits up. Reversed across, Bach at the window pondering. With a swift lash of movement, the double tubes of a stethoscope are whipped over his head and tightened around his throat. Drummond, mad as a hatter. I am the fool for Christ and the Paraclete of Caborca. Close two-shot of Bach being strangled, Drummond's face frozen in bland dementia behind him. Barbara's voice off-screen. For heaven's sake, Dad, what the hell's going on? Drummond pauses in his strangling, and, releasing the poor man altogether, turns to his daughter in the doorway. Camera dollies to include all three. Bach recuperating, Drummond staring madly, and Barbara infuriated with her father. Barbara, annoyed. We all thought you were at death's door. What are you doing out of bed? Drummond, abashed, stands there, a scolded schoolboy, a raw-boned figure in a hospital shift, a stethoscope dangling from his right hand. Barbara, to Bach. What happened? Did he say anything to you? Bach, sufficiently recovered. As a matter of fact, he said, I am the fool for Christ and the Paraclete of Caborca. And you better close the door, because if he's going to tell everyone who walks in here he's the fool for Christ and the Paraclete of Caborca, they'll put us all away. He's already killed 2 doctors and 1 nurse. Drummond. I am the wrath of the Lamb and the angel of the bottomless pit. Barbara. What do you mean he killed 2 doctors and a nurse? Bach. I mean he's killed 2 doctors and a nurse, and he just tried to kill me. He has something against doctors. Somehow he got a hold of 1,000 units of insulin and put it in Dr. Schaefer's intravenous solution. How he got Dr. Ives to die of a heart attack in the middle of the emergency room. And somehow he got a dialysis nurse named Campanella to die of anesthesia shock on an operating table. Opens the closet, points to the white doctor's uniform hanging there. He's been running around the hospital wearing Dr. Schaefer's uniform. Right now, they're looking all over the place for this mysterious Dr. Schaefer. I know this all sounds as grotesque to you as it does to me, but you can see for yourself your father is not the helpless, comatose patient we thought he was. Don't look at me like I'm the one who's crazy. Ask your crazy father. Drummond. I was merely an instrument of God. I killed no one. They all three died by their own hands, ritual victims of their own institutions, murdered by irony, an eye for an eye, biblical retribution. Schaefer was first, you see, because he killed God. God was admitted to this hospital last Monday under the name of Guernsey. Room 806, morning flashback. A cheerless gray sunlight fills the room as the fragile, white-haired, and bearded old Guernsey, whose admittance to the hospital was the opening scene of the film, is being helped into the room by Nurse Felicia Chile. She solicitously helps the wispy old man off with his coat and jacket and hat, which she puts in the armoire. With palsied fingers, the little old man unknots his stringy tie and unbuttons the collar, which is 3 sizes too large. In the other bed, Drummond's eyes slowly open. Drummond, off-screen. I was instantly aware of a divine presence. The old man is slipping out of his clothes to expose a thin little body in a torn nightshirt. Drummond, off-screen. I was convinced this porcelain old man was, in fact, an angel of the Lord. The old man sits back, wheezing a little. Nurse Chile smiles nicely at him and takes her leave. For a moment, Drummond lies rigidly on his bed, staring dully into the air, and the old man sits with his hunched back to us. The room is silent except for his roomy wheeze. Drummond, off-screen. Perhaps even Christ himself. After a moment, the old man rises and goes to the wash basin, and with some wheezing, spits into it. He shuffles back to bed. Dr. Schaefer comes into the room with a professional smile and the patient Guernsey's chart. Drummond, off-screen. Our Savior was, it seems, suffering from emphysema. Schaefer perches on the bed beside Guernsey and begins to take his history. Drummond, off-screen. He was relentlessly subjected to the benefits of modern medicine. He was misdiagnosed, mismedicated, and put into shock by Dr. Schaefer, raced off to intensive care, where the resident compounded the blunder and induced a coma. I can tell you with authority that God is indeed dead. He died last Monday under the name of Guernsey. Close-up of Drummond in deep shadow shows him sleeping. Drummond, off-screen. A few hours later, he appeared to me in a revelation. Room 806, night, 7 p.m. The room is lit only by the yellow light from the half-opened bathroom door. Guernsey walks out of the shadows, hands raised. He shuffles to Drummond's bedside and looks down on him from his frail height. Guernsey, softly. Rise up, Drummond. You are dead. Now you are restored. Drummond's eyes open and roll to the direction of the voice. Drummond's POV. Guernsey, dressed only in his hospital shift, is shuffling up and down the aisle of the room, hands clasped behind his back like a Middle European intellectual, head hunched forward, a little old man with a white beard talking to himself. Guernsey. Those who killed you and those who killed me will die in our place. You are the paraclete of Kaborka, the wrath of the Lamb, the angel of the bottomless pit. Guernsey closes his eyes in religious ecstasy. Guernsey. In this fashion has it been revealed to you. Drummond starts to sob and slowly sits up in his bed, imbued with belief. He looks mutely up at the frail old man, who now raises his right hand, and his face is transfigured into vast majesty. Guernsey thunders out. The age is closed. The end is at hand. The seal is broken. So saying, he reverts to the little old man he was, wheezing a bit, and with some effort climbs back on his bed and lies there, eyes closed. His thin, high nose projects from the whiteness of his face. He sighs the rattling last sigh of life and dies. Camera dollies slowly to close-up of Drummond lying motionless in his bed. His eyes are wide, glinting in the shadows, a man imbued. His cheeks are wet with tears of exultation. Drummond, off-screen. Well, not quite the burning bush perhaps, but prodigal enough for me. I was to avenge the death of God and my own brutalization. I was to kill Doctors Schaefer, Ives, and Welbeck, and the dialysis nurse Miss Campanella, whose negligence caused my coma. Full shot of Drummond. He raises his left hand, flexing his fingers. Then he moves his other arm, his head, his shoulders. Obviously, he is regaining his faculties. Drummond, off-screen. I awaited a further sign from God, which was given to me later that evening. Dr. Schaefer, it seems, had arranged an assignation with a girl from the hematology lab named Sheila. Across the Drummond to the now empty other bed. All the lights are on. Pan on Nurse Penny Canduso, and an orderly wheeling away the wrapped body of Guernsey. Intern Schaefer at the door considers the empty bed with interest. Moving to the bed table, he picks up the receiver of the phone. Schaefer, on phone. Hey, Sheila? This is Howard. Sheila. Hey, listen. I got us a bed for tonight. A real, honest-to-God bed. Room 806. Night. Reprise. The scene originally played under credits where Dr. Schaefer and his girlfriend Sheila sneak into the room and undress. Giggles and shushings, gooses and fondles. Sheila. Boy, I sure hope nobody walks in. During the replay, however, an additional segment is added. At one point, the girl, hanging her dress in the armoire, turns and holds something up. Sheila. What's this in your pocket? Schaefer. That's my insulin. Put it back. Sheila. What do you take insulin for? Diabetes? I didn't know you were a diabetic. Schaefer. It ain't contagious. Don't worry about it. They head for the unoccupied bed. Close up on Drummond's profile. Room 806. Dark, hushed. Schaefer's girl is leaving. She tiptoes to the door, peeks out. Apparently the coast is clear. She quickly slips out. Room 806, day. Drummond on his chair. Barbara perched on one side of her father's bed, Bach on the other. William Meade sleeps on. Bach. And you put Schaefer's insulin into the IV jar. Drummond. Yes. And then a second nurse came in and plugged the IV jar into Schaefer. God clearly intended a measure of irony here. The hospital was to do all the killing for me. All I need to do is arrange for the doctors to become patients in their own hospital. Accordingly, the next morning I set out for Dr. Ives. I put on Dr. Schaefer's uniform, pinched some Dexoxine from the pharmacy and a sandbag from the utility cart, and found my way to Dr. Ives's laboratory. I coshed him with the sandbag, gave him a massive shot of the dioxine. This, you see, brought on an instant condition of cardiac arrhythmia. When he came to, I brought him down to the emergency room. Emergency room area, lobby, day. The usual ER crush and motion goes on in the background. Drummond escorts an obviously ill Dr. Ives to the admitting room. Drummond's voice under the narration explains matters to Miss Aronovici at the desk. Drummond. This is Dr. Ives. He's in the nephrology lab. I was brought in there a little while ago and he was suddenly taken ill. And I thought I'd better get him over here right away. Drummond, off screen. He had at that time perhaps an hour to live. Prompt treatment would have saved his life. They go into the emergency admitting and treatment rooms. Ives, seated on a table in evident distress, breathes heavily. Drummond, voice off. As a staff doctor, he was seen without preliminaries. An attendant takes his pulse, pressure, and respiration. Ives collapses. Drummond, voice off. His vital signs were taken, an electrocardiogram. Pan slowly across the emergency room to catch its state of contained febrility. Every curtained treatment room is occupied, including the storage room in the back. The triage nurse and a second nurse behind the desk are busy on the phones. The triage nurse takes the history of the first in a line of 5 people seeking admission even as she answers her phone. We watch Miss Aronovici and the other nurse and Dr. Spezio and his 2 interns, the 2 attendants, all busy with one patient or another. Drummond, voice off, which revealed occasional ventricular premature contractions. An intern took his history. Across Drummond, white uniformed, standing in the back against the filing cabinets and linens, watching the new patients trickle and crowd in. Drummond, voice off. And then he was promptly... At the admitting desk, a man in his 40s is being signed in by a uniformed cop. Drummond, voice off. Simply forgotten to death. Simply mislaid. Camera just stares at the pageant of pain. Drummond, voice off. Mislaid among the broken wrists, the chest pains, scalp lacerations, the man whose fingers were crushed in a taxi door, the infant with the skin rash, the child swiped by a car, the old lady mugged in the subway, the derelict beaten by sailors, the teenage suicide, the paranoids, drunks, asthmatics, the rapes, the septic abortions, the overdosed addicts. Emergency room area lobby. Looking to the street doors as 2 ambulance attendants bearing a 17-year-old black girl on a stretcher burst in. Ambulance attendants shouting, "Not breathing, not breathing." They hurry into the admitting room, past the nurse, and into the emergency admitting and treatment rooms, which is already galvanized into action. Miss Aronovici is at the girl's pulse, even as she is being transferred to the bed that has just been cleared of Mr. Mitgang in his concussion case. Intern, instructing attendant with Mitgang, "Better put him in the holding room." Miss Aronovici with a 17-year-old girl. "She's taking a little pulse." Dr. Spezio to triage nurse. "Get an anesthesiologist. 1515. On screen, we continue watching the scene of the overdose case treatment as the live-action sound in the room fades behind Drummond's tale. Drummond, off-screen. The fractures, infarcts, hemorrhages, concussions, boils, abrasions, the colonic cancers, the cardiac arrests, the whole wounded madhouse of our times. Reaction shot of Drummond staring at this ceaseless panorama of pain. Tears streaking down his cheeks. Man's voice off screen. "I wonder if I could have a minute of your time, doctor." Drummond turns to the voice. Camera pulls back to include the man who had been brought into the ER by a uniformed cop. Drummond. "I am the fool for Christ and the paraclete of Caborca." Nameless man. "Well, it's an honor and a privilege, doctor. I've been here 10 minutes and I can't seem to get anybody to help me. I'm suffering from some sort of amnesia. I can't remember my name. As a matter of fact, it's pretty screwy. I got mugged. 2 hours ago, walking out of a coffee shop on 57th and 2nd Avenue, 8 o'clock in the morning, broad daylight, I got mugged. A 16-year-old girl walks up to me, shows me a knife about a yard long, and says, "Give me your wallet." I thought she was kidding. I mean, there's hundreds of people walking by. Well, she wasn't kidding. "Listen," I said, "all I got's about $20. So she takes the wallet anyway. So I said, "How about leaving me my identification? I mean, I have my driver's license, my diners club, my credit cards." But she took them all. The whole damn wallet, credit cards, everything. So I stopped some guy. I said, "Hey, you see that girl there walking away?" He says, "Yeah." I said, "She just stole my wallet, credit cards, and everything." He says, "Well, that's what they want, the credit cards." So I started looking for a cop. I mean, go find a cop, right? Well, I finally find a cop. The girl's halfway to South America by now. Probably bought the ticket with my credit cards. So the cop says, "What's your name?" And you want to know something? I couldn't think of my name. The girl took all my identification, you know what I mean? She took all my credit cards. So I said, this is screwy. I can't think of my name. So he took me to this station house. The sergeant says, "What's your name?" I said, "I don't know. She took all my credit cards." So they took me down here. So what do you think, doctor? I'm nuts, right? I finally flipped. Pan slowly to Drummond, who stares at the nameless man. In background, the door opens and Mrs. Cushing, the lady from accounting, enters. She calls out in her annoying voice from a chart. Mrs. Cushing. "Who's number 76802S? Is there anybody here who is that number?" Drummond, off screen. In this way was it revealed to me the manner of Nurse Campanella's death. She was to die of the great American plague, vestigial identity. Return from flashback. Room 806, day. Drummond, in his hospital shift, gaunt and mad as a prophet, sits rigidly on his chair. Barbara perches on her father's bed. Bach wanders disorientedly about the room, staring incredulously first at Barbara and then at her father. Drummond. So last night I coshed Miss Campanella with a sandbag, sedated her with Thorazine, shaved her, prepped her, and parked her in a corridor of the X-ray department for 5 hours. Bach. Why X-ray? Drummond. Well, at X-ray, a sedated body lying around unattended for 5 hours wouldn't seem unusual. Bach. Of course. Drummond. Her operation, that is to say, Mrs. Mangafrani's operation, was not scheduled until 9:30. So at 9:15 this morning, I rang for my nurse. Bach. You rang for your nurse? Drummond. To ensure 1 full hour of uninterrupted privacy. Bach. Oh, yes. Drummond. I got up, wheeled Miss Campanella off to the operating rooms, replaced her bed with Mrs. Mangafrani's, exchanged charts and identity bracelets. She died officially of anesthesia shock, but in point of fact, she died because she was wearing another woman's identity. Barbara to Bach. God, what do we do now? Let me take him back to Mexico. It's a simple world there. If you turn him in, they'll just cage him in the Rockland State Hospital for the criminally insane. Let me take him back, Herb. Bach. Are you kidding? We'll both take him. I'm going with you. Get him dressed. We're getting out of here before the police put us all in Rockland State. Drummond. I haven't finished my work here. I have this Welbeck to dispose of. I am the angel of the bottomless pit and the wrath of the Lamb. Barbara. Oh dear, he's having another revelation. Bach holds Drummond's coat and hat and crosses to take his arm. He finds the entranced Drummond as rigid as a statue. Bach. Look, that ambulance must be here by now. You go down and get them. I'll give him a shot of something to knock him out. We'll take him to the airport in the ambulance. They both hurry out of the room. Drummond remains enmarbled in his trance. Camera suddenly moves down to William Meade, whose eyes now open. He has heard it all. In background, Drummond, suddenly realized from his catatonic trance, heads for the armoire and extracts the white trousers of Dr. Schaefer's uniform. He puts them on, tucking in the tails of his hospital shift. He notices William Meade staring at him. Drummond. You're hallucinating again. William Meade just stares at Drummond. 8th floor nurses station and lobby area. Bach and Barbara come hurrying around the corner from the west corridor. Barbara heads for the elevators. Bach heads for the nurses station. The 8th floor is going about its normal 1:15 p.m. activity. Mrs. Donovan is at her desk on the phone. Mrs. Donovan. Edwards never showed up. I'm short-staffed as hell. It's just me and Felicia. It's like Sunday. Nobody's here. Dr. Bigelman. I'll be at lunch. A nurse's aide, a bathrobed patient, and 2 of his visitors stroll by. It's the end of the lunch hour when the kitchen workers bring used trays back. Mrs. Donovan. Yeah, you gotta send me somebody. Oh yeah? Bach moves past Mrs. Donovan and into the pharmacy, where we see him scouring the shelves for Thorazine and a syringe. An elevator arrives, disgorging Milton Meade and his resident assistant, Thomas Hitchcock, and of course, all people, Dr. Richard Welbeck himself. Barbara and Dr. Bigelman go into the elevator. The doors close. Milton Meade and Hitchcock head for the west corridor. Welbeck, in his natty double-breasted suit and carrying his cashmere coat, heads straight for the nurses' station. Meade. We'll be in 806. Mrs. Donovan chuckles into the phone. Then what did he say? Then what did she say? Welbeck to Mrs. Donovan. I'm Dr. Welbeck. I have a patient on this floor named Drummond, and I'd like to see his chart. Mrs. Donovan. I'll call you back. Bach immediately emerges from the pharmacy holding a bottle of Thorazine and a wrapped hypodermic syringe. He scowls at Welbeck, who scowls back. Welbeck. Oh, Dr. Bach, can I have a few minutes of your time, sir? Bach. No. He starts to pass Mrs. Donovan and would continue, but Welbeck lays a restraining hand on his arm. Welbeck. Dr. Gilly tells me you're the one who initiated these proceedings against me. Bach. I'm busy, Welbeck. Welbeck. I'd like to know what you have against me. Bach. You turned up half-stoned for a simple nephrectomy 8 days ago, botched it, put the patient into failure, and damn near killed him. Then, pausing only to send in your bill, you flew off on the wings of a man to an island of sun in Montego Bay. This is the 3rd time in 2 years we've had to patch up your patients. The other 2 died. You're greedy, unfeeling, inept, indifferent, self-inflating, and unconscionably profitable. Aside from that, I have nothing against you. I'm sure you play a hell of a game of golf. What else do you want to know? Welbeck's pocket beeper beeps. Welbeck. Excuse me for a moment, doctor. He reaches over the nurse's desk for a phone. This is Dr. Welbeck. Were you paging me? Regarding Bach with a cold scorn. How much do you make a year, Bach? For a guy who makes a lousy 40, 50 grand on phone. Hello? Arthur. I understand you've been trying to reach me all morning. Bach heads back for 8th floor west corridor, and down that through the kitchen workers and strolling patients to room 806, which he enters. He is startled to find Milton Meade and Hitchcock leaning over William Meade, who is up on one elbow and in a state. William Meade. I'm telling you, Milton, he pulls out all the wires and the tubes, and he gets up and puts on a doctor's uniform, and he goes out and he murders doctors. He just went out 10 seconds before you came in. Indeed, there is no Drummond to be seen. His bed is empty. Bach nods to Milton Meade and Hitchcock, who nod back and crosses quickly into the bathroom, which is likewise empty. William Meade. And I'll tell you something else about this crazy place you got here. There was a naked Indian in here last night doing a war dance. That's the kind of crazy place you're running here, Milton. You got to get me out of here, Milton. This is a crazy place, Milton. Milton Meade's pocket beeper beeps. Milton Meade reaches for the phone. William Meade, appealing to Bach. I wake up last night. There's a goddamn Indian in here, a naked Indian. What kind of hospital is this? Milton Meade, on phone. This is Mr. Meade. Are you paging me? William Meade. A couple hours later, I wake up again, and the guy in that bed there is getting out of the bed. Milton Meade, to Hitchcock. Are the police still in the building? Hitchcock. Yes. Milton Meade. You'd better get them up here. Yes. William Meade. All day long, he lays there like a dead man. All of a sudden, in the middle of the night, he gets out of bed. I thought I was going crazy. Milton Meade, on phone. Yes. Mrs. Meade. Oh dear. When? William Meade. You know what he says to me? He says, you're hallucinating. Listen, I just saw a naked Indian. Now I'm seeing a ghost. I gotta figure he's right. I'm hallucinating, right? Milton Meade. I'll be down directly. Hangs up. Never rains, but it pours. A fire just broke out in one of those condemned buildings. The squatters in the building came out. The police tried to arrest them, and apparently the situation has erupted into a riot. To Bach as he heads for the door. I'm sure you're wondering what this is all about, Herb. William Meade. You're not going to leave me alone in this crazy place, Milton? Milton Meade, at the door with Bach. Mr. Hitchcock is staying with you. Hitchcock. You better call the cops, Tom. William Meade. Milton. 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 The door slams. West Corridor and Nurses Station. Bach and Milton Meade stride up the corridor through the linen wagons and kitchen carts. Milton Meade. I haven't the time now, and I'm not even going to try to tell you this curious story my brother just told me. I'll fill you in on it at lunch sometime. He waves his hand helplessly to indicate the utter incredulity of it all. Milton Meade rushes not to miss the elevator. Hold it! They reach an open elevator. Meade goes in, the doors close. The doors of a second elevator then open, and Barbara comes out. She and Bach stare at each other. In background, Welbeck is on the phone at the nurses' station. Barbara. The ambulance is here. Bach. Yeah, but your father isn't. He's disappeared. He put on Schaefer's uniform and has gone out to do God's work. Presumably the murder of Dr. Welbeck. Except that fellow on the phone over there is Dr. Welbeck. Welbeck, in background on the phone. Oh my God, Arthur. What are you talking about? Have you talked to Dr. Hogan about this? Bach. And on top of everything else, the other patient in your father's room overheard his whole confession and just told Chief Administrator of the hospital. They're sending for the cops. Reversing across, Welbeck on phone at nurse's station. In the background, Bach and Barbara stare at him. Welbeck, almost apoplectic on the phone. Oh my God, Arthur. Well, who held title? Do the underwriters know about this yet? Oh my God. Arthur, what are you waiting for? Arrest the son of a bitch. Turn him in. Oh my God, when? Of course, Arthur, call me right back. I'm at the Holly Pavilion, 8th floor. Please, right away. He hangs up. Bach. Are you all right, Welbeck? Welbeck. All right. That son of a bitch is trying to wipe me out. My partner, the eminent orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Noel Hogan, is a miserable thief, and he's trying to wipe me out. Mrs. Donovan, extending a chart. Mr. Drummond's chart, Doctor. Welbeck angrily seizes the chart. What room is it? Mrs. Donovan, 806. Welbeck. I'm expecting a phone call. Put it straight through to me in that room. He strides off angrily, followed by an anxious Bach and Barbara for the 8th floor west corridor. Bach and Barbara hurry along in Welbeck's wake. Welbeck. The son of a bitch has been draining the company with phony purchase orders on another company, of which it now turns out his wife is the principal stockholder. Parent fraud. I'll send him up for 20 years. He wrenches open the door of 806, marches in, followed by Bach and Barbara. 8th floor, room 806. Welbeck advances on William Meade's bed, since he is the only patient in the room. Hitchcock is on the phone. Welbeck. Well, Drummond, you don't seem that much the worse for the wear. William Meade stares dully at Welbeck. Then he looks dully at Bach. Welbeck to Hitchcock. Would you mind using some other phone? I'm expecting an important call. William Meade. What is this? Who is this guy? Hitchcock on phone. Yes, well, I'll be at the nurse's desk, Sergeant. It would be futile for me to try to explain this to you over the phone. Welbeck, leafing through Drummond's chart. You've got a bit of a fever, Drummond, but you're coming along very well. William Meade, I'm not Drummond, you monkey. Drummond's the other bed. The phone now buzzes. Welbeck and Hitchcock both head for it. Welbeck, that's mine. On phone. It's Welbeck here. Yes, Arthur, go ahead. William Meade is painfully trying to get off his bed. William Meade, I'm getting out of this nut house. Bach, pushing him gently back. All right, take it easy, Mr. Meade. Hitchcock, satisfied the call is not for him, exits. William Meade, I came in here just to get a lousy polyp cut out. Welbeck on phone. Oh my God. What do you mean? How many transactions were there? But Arthur, I borrowed against that stock. I'm in the hole for over $300,000. William Meade, appealing to the gods. I'm a sick man. I'm supposed to have peace and quiet. Welbeck, on phone and apoplectic. What do you mean, Brazil? I just spoke to Hogan's office yesterday, and they just told me. The phone slips from his fingers. He turns to stare at Bach and Barbara. Welbeck. I'm wiped out. The SEC has suspended trading in my stock. He keels over like a felled tree, falling face up on Drummond's bed, his legs dangling to the floor. William Meade promptly hides his head under his sheet. Bach moves quickly to the prostrate Welbeck, feels his throat for the carotid pulse, pulls out his stethoscope, rips Welbeck's shirt open and listens for heart sounds. He picks up the dangling telephone receiver, gets a dial tone. Bach, on phone. Cardiac arrest, Holly 8. Barbara strips off her coat. She is still in nurse's uniform. She leans into the hall and calls a passing nurse. Barbara, we have an emergency here. Bach rips off Welbeck's natty jacket. Breathe him. Barbara helps Bach get Welbeck's dead weight onto the floor. On his knees, Bach straddles Welbeck's prone form, balls his fist, and belts Welbeck on his chest. He begins intensive heart massage. Barbara gets down on her knees, opens Welbeck's mouth, and commences mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. In the background, the PA system blandly echoes. PA system off-screen. CAC, Holly 8, Please clear all corridors. Mrs. Donovan and aides move CAC into the room, immediately followed by intern Chandler rushing past them. Mrs. Donovan. Where's Bagelman? Chandler. He went to lunch. Mrs. Donovan. Natch, get that other bed out of here. William Meade, of course, is still huddled under his sheet. He peers out from under his covers in wide-eyed disbelief and ducks under again. Bach massages Welbeck's heart. Barbara continues mouth to mouth. Nurse Felicia Chile hurries in, pushing the emergency cart before her. Barbara, to Nurse Chile as the others begin moving William Meade's bed out of the room. Give him ambu bag and an airway. Voice off screen. What's been happening? Nurse Chile has shunted the emergency cart aside to let the bed out and is extracting the ambu bag and tube from the cart's lower shelf. Chandler, to 7th floor nursing supervisor just outside door. Watch it. PA system off screen. CAC, Holly 8, please clear all corridors. Nurse Chile hands the Behrman airway and ambu bag to Barbara, who inserts the airway and the ambu tube into Welbeck's mouth and pumps in air by hand. Bach massages away. 8th floor west corridor, Mrs. Donovan and intern Chandler finally get Meade and his bed out into the corridor where they park it. In background, emergency activity on all sides. The resident cardiologist, Dr. Geoffrey Morse, and an anesthesiologist, Dr. Lawrence Loomis, both 33, come hurtling around the corner. Dr. Morse. In here? Mrs. Donovan. Yeah. She follows Morse in as, from the lobby corner, 2 technicians come racing a Max cart and an IV stand before them. Behind them, a bewildered Hitchcock moves into view, trying to determine what's going on. Hitchcock to intern Chandler. Who is it? PA system off screen. Dr. Robert Jackson? Chandler. One of the cardiac arrest. Hitchcock looks down at the sheeted figure hunched on the bed parked in the hallway and slowly pulls the sheet off his head. William Meade stares up at him like a hunted animal. Hitchcock covers Meade's head again. Room 806. Bach still massages, sweating bullets by now. Barbara works the ambu bag. Dr. Morse is feeling Welbeck's groin for his femoral pulse. Mr. Morse, what do you have, Dr. Bach? Bach. Total cardiac arrest. PA system off screen. Dr. Rigby, Dr. Lilac. Dr. Morse. How long has he been like this? Bach. About a minute. No pulse, no heartbeat, no respiration. If we can see anything of Welbeck through other bodies, we noticed almost all his clothes have been ripped off his body. Dr. Loomis replaces Barbara. Dr. Loomis. All right, I'll take over. The 2 nursing supervisors have been getting the Max cart ready, snapping up the gate-leg footrest and attaching the IV tube to the oxygen jar and that to the ambu bag. Bach. Endotracheal tube. Donovan, rushing in background with others. I'm sorry, doctor, but we have another emergency in 823. Chandler. Endotracheal tube. Dr. Loomis. Shall we get him up on the cart? Dr. Morse. Yeah. Doctors Loomis, Bach, and Morse struggle to lift the nearly naked dead weight of Dr. Welbeck up from the floor and onto the Max cart. Dr. Morse has picked up Drummond's chart from the bed where Welbeck had left it. Dr. Morse. All right, who is this patient? What's the story on this patient? Close-up of Bach trying to hoist Welbeck into looking up slowly. Dr. Morse. Is this his chart, Dr. Bach? Bach cocks his head to him. Dr. Morse. What's his name? Drummond? Bach looks across to Barbara, now helping out at the Max cart. She looks back at Bach. She shrugs. He shrugs. They exchange a smile. Bach. Yes, his name's Drummond. That's his chart. Straining under the effort, the three doctors get Welbeck off the floor. Dr. Morse studying the chart. Oh, Christ. The poor son of a bitch just had a nephrectomy a week ago. Mrs. Donovan exits into 8th floor west corridor. As Mrs. Donovan comes out, Hitchcock turns to her. Hitchcock. Was it Drummond? Mrs. Donovan. Who else would it be? Hitchcock silently thanks God. Room 806. Dr. Morse off screen. Pick him up. Put him on it. Stop the massage. Welbeck's body is finally on the Max cart. Nurses and doctors converge on him. Dr. Loomis sets about intubating Welbeck, and the nursing supervisor begins clamping the metal bands of the EKG machine on each of Welbeck's extremities. While all this goes on, Bach and Barbara have picked up the remnants of Welbeck's jacket, trousers, shirt, and underwear. Dr. Morse is squatting by the Max cart reading the EKG script as it rolls slowly out of the cart. Dr. Morse. Ventricular fibrillation. Give me the paddles. Push another amp of bicarb. The nursing supervisor starts applying electrode paste to the defibrillating paddles. Another nurse measures off an ampule of bicarbonate of soda, which Dr. Loomis injects into the IV tube. Dr. Morse. Set it for 200. Barbara unsnaps her father's valise and stuffs Welbeck's garments in it. Bach takes Welbeck's coat and piles Drummond's things on top of that. The nursing supervisor hands Dr. Morse the defibrillating paddles to place on Welbeck's left breast. Nurse, off screen. That's 200. Dr. Morse. Everybody back away. All back away from the Max cart. Bach and Barbara are at the window, piled up with valise and coats. They look like they're off for Europe. Dr. Morse, off screen. 1, 2, 3. He pushes the defibrillating button, sending an electric shock through Welbeck's body so as to bounce it into the air. Bach and Barbara remain at the window with heart resuscitation team in background. Barbara slips into her own coat in preparation for escape. Dr. Morse in background. Did he convert? Dr. Loomis in background. No, he's still fibrillating. Dr. Morse in background. Let's go to 400. Barbara. Sato voice to Bach. Now. Bach is staring out the window. Barbara stares out with him. Their POV. Looking down onto the U-shaped drive of the entrance plaza of the hospital and First Avenue full of traffic. A band of some 50 black and Puerto Rican youths, including females and young white revolutionaries, most in Che Guevara garb, have broken past the security guards at the gates and spill across the drive. Some policemen and security guards move tentatively out of the hospital to intercept them. The shouting can't be heard from up here. Off-screen, we hear the activities of the resuscitation team. Nursing supervisor, off-screen. It's 400. Dr. Morse, off-screen. Everybody back. 1, 2, 3. Sound of the shock. Dr. Morse, off-screen. That didn't work either. First Avenue, high shot. Low crowd noises. Bach looks out the window at the protesting mob below. Dr. Morse, off-screen. All right, let me have a cc of adrenaline and intercardiac needle. Camera pans slowly up over the melee in the plaza to the fence. Barbara and Bach stare down at the crowd. Dr. Morse off-screen. Stop the massage. Ventricular fibrillation. Put another amp of bicarb. 200. Zoom down into the maelstrom to full shot of the Reverend Drummond dressed in Schaefer's white uniform, standing on the slim island separating the uptown traffic from the downtown traffic. Drummond is a private island of his own, hands stretched to the skies. He is prophesying. Drummond, barely audible above the traffic rumbling heedlessly around him. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, for the age is closed, the season of the seventh seal is at hand. Room 806. Bach and Barbara slip through the doctors and nurses heading for the door. Dr. Morse. Hang-a-sopril 2 and 500. Let's take one more crack with the paddles. Everybody back off the cart. Bach, carrying 2 overcoats, and Barbara wearing hers and carrying her father's valise, exit into 8th floor west corridor. As Bach and Barbara come out, the activity is normal, with the exception of William Meade's bed along the wall. Hitchcock and 2 overcoated men are in the hallway, and Hitchcock hurries to Bach. Hitchcock. Is he dead? Bach. They can't get him out of fib. I don't think he'll make it. Hitchcock. Thank God. Sighs turns to the 2 detectives. This should close the case, Sergeant. Bach and Barbara hurry toward the elevators. The hospital Holly Pavilion lobby. The small army of militants and activists has broken through the security into the lobby. Their entrance is greeted by one small scream from a woman in the lobby. A leader of the invading troop calls out, "Leader, everybody take it easy. Nobody's going to be hurt, we just want the director." Others in the troop shout reassurances, but it doesn't really reassure anybody. The lady in the gift shop closes her door and locks up. People crowd in a solid block in the doorway to the coffee shop to see what's going on. From the long tunnels of corridors, nurses, doctors, administrative personnel pause in their chores and errands and missions to watch the tide of events in the lobby. Holly Pavilion Executive Corridor. The exit door is wrenched open, and Bach comes hurtling into the carpeted executive corridor toward the lobby. And at that moment, the troop of militants come rumbling in from the other end. Every door of the corridor fills with secretaries and administrators unsure of what's happening. Then, Sundstrom elbows his way through the clutch of secretaries in his doorway and comes into the corridor. He regards the militants moving down the corridor toward him. Shouting crowd. We want Sundstrom. We want Sundstrom. Community control, community control. Hip, hip, Hippocrates. Up with service, down with fees. Sundstrom, you people want to see me? First militant. Yeah, baby, we want to see you. Second militant. We're taking over this hospital, man. Sundstrom. I've had it up to here. I'm not dealing with this kind of cheap blackmail. Leader. Now look, man. Now wait a minute there. First militant. We're looking for a hostage. Leader. 14 people just got arrested for doing... In the background, one of their fellow revolutionaries speaks up. Man. Look it, man. Where's the TV camera? But he's shut up by the leader. Leader. Would you be cool, man? Now yelling. 14 people got arrested for doing nothing but living in their homes, which you people threw them out of. Crowd. Right on. Leader. So now we're going to arrest you. We're going to hold you hostage and we ain't letting you go in. Ambler. The medical student we met during Bach's teaching rounds pushes in front of the leader to face Sundstrom. Ambler. We, the members of the Doctors' Liberation Committee, indict this hospital for the criminal neglect of the community in which it is situated. We demand an immediate dissolution of the governing and executive boards. Shout. What are you going to do about those 14 ghetto people? As the shouts continue, Sundstrom raises a hand to quiet the crowd. Sundstrom. I'm not going to do anything about anything. Shout. Yes, you are. Sundstrom. By God, if you want to take over this hospital, you take it over. Shouts. We will. Right on. Sundstrom. You run it. I'm finished. I quit. You run it. You pay the bills. You fight the city. Militant. We will. Sundstrom. You fight the state. You fight the unions. You fight the community. You think you can do a better job? You do it. Now I am finished. I quit. It's all yours. Eyes filled with tears of rage. Sundstrom lowers his head and moves into the mass of militants, which parts for him to leave. Crowd. Quit. Quit. The mass engulfs Sundstrom, moving back out into the lobby with him, pushing him, shoving him, humiliating him. Reaction shot of Bach watching it all from the far end of the corridor. He closes his eyes, and the pain of watching all this shows on his face. He opens his eyes. The corridor is now silent and empty. He hurries to Holly Pavilion, the lobby. Bach rushes in as the milling throng dissolves into the bystanders. Security, police city, and city cops. Common sense has settled in, and the general tenor is to avoid any further trouble. We can hear the rhythmic patter of cops. Shouts of cops. All right, come on, let's clear the area. Come on, let's clear this place. Keep cool. Everybody keep cool. Bach elbows his way through the throng as it drifts toward the doors to the hospital, entrance plaza, day, and goes through the gathering police. A mobile TV camera crew and a few reporters are hurrying up through the gates from First Avenue. First Avenue, day. The Reverend Drummond stands, a solitary human island among the shrill roar of the city. The protesters protest endlessly, chanting, shouting. Absolutely no one pays any attention to the gaunt, doctor-clad 60-year-old man standing on an island. Except, of course, for Bach, who must pause to wait for a red light. Bach hustles through the traffic to where Drummond stands. Drummond. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, for the age is closed. The season of the seventh seal is at hand. The age is closed. The season of the seventh seal. Bach. Dr. Welbeck is dead. They thought he was you. Drummond. Yes, I know. We must arrange to have his body shipped to my Apache village where we will bury him with full tribal rights. In a day or two, somebody will ask, whatever happened to Dr. Welbeck? And it will be assumed he absconded to Brazil to join his partner, the eminent orthopedic surgeon Dr. Noel Hogan. Welbeck, too, was mislaid, overlooked, forgotten to death, you see. The ambulance pulls up and Barbara gets out of it. Barbara, taking her father around to the back. We have to hurry, Dad. The light turns green, the traffic starts flowing around them, disjoined by the ambulance blocking one lane on each side of the dividing island. An ambulance attendant has opened the back doors to get Drummond in. Barbara hurries toward the front, climbs in, holds the door open for Bach. He stands a few paces back. Bach. I'm not going. He moves to the ambulance, closes the door. The hospital's coming apart. I can't walk out on it when it's coming apart. Somebody has to be responsible, Barbara. Everybody's hitting the road, running to the hills, running away. Somebody's got to be responsible. Across Barbara to the driver. Kennedy Airport, you've got a 2:30 flight to make. He turns and the ambulance pulls away. Bach goes back to the sidewalk where he meets Sundstrom, now wearing his coat. Bach. You going back in? Sundstrom. Yeah. They make their way back toward the hospital entrance plaza. The two physicians trudge across the U-Drive. Sundstrom, matter-of-factly. It's like pissing in the wind, right, Herb? Bach. Right. Fade out. The end.